Well, welcome to Medieval Studies 400, historical novels and historical fiction. Philippa Gregory's Wars of the Roses. This is the class that's been meeting since September. We still have 4 weeks to go. Students will be presenting their research papers after we do Lady of the Rivers next week. And thank you so much for making time for this.
Thank you. Hello, Chris. Hello, everybody. I can see you. Come on in. Don't mind being late.
So how shall we begin? You all read the online article that I sent along, right? We could talk about that first, perhaps, and then maybe get into specific questions as soon as they have. I have a question for you too at some point.
Okay, sure.
Has anyone read the author, not Ferguson, the novelist?
Jane Smiley?
Smiley, yes.
No.
She's written one medieval one, the Greenlanders, I guess. It's sort of takes off on Norse sagas and talks about, I guess, fictional families in Greenland, Viking people, I suppose. But just wanted to get your thoughts about this debate or conflict or relationship between the fiction world, historical, academic world.
Sure. Shall I just tell you?
Please.
Okay. It seems to me that what there is such a thing as history, which is the past events, and we know that they happened. What you then have is the first layer of the record of them, which you often come across in the period that I'm looking in, maybe letters. Often letters from ambassadors back to their masters, kings or the Pope. Often it's letters that are the first document that records the event that happened. Sometimes you get a sort of a report which might be written from, say, a spy to, say, the king. So you sometimes get something like that, and then sometimes you get private letters. Not very often, but for instance, the Paston letters are from a husband in London to his wife who's running the country estate. And so you get little glimpses of things, and that's, in a sense, the first record. That's the first historical source. And of course, it's got a relationship to fiction, that it's incredibly biased. So the ambassadors are always, if you read anything that Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, writes home to about Anne Boleyn, who is, of course, trying to take the position of his master, the emperor, what you get is this incredibly slanted view of Anne Boleyn, and also an incredibly slanted view of how great Chapuis is doing. Because part of his report is going to be, I'm doing the best I can. You really can't blame me for the fact that it's all going horribly wrong. So even in the first sort of record, you've got a fictional slant, a bias. Someone is creating a version of what happened. So you have to deal with that as a historian. And then, of course, all the historians look at almost all the same documents. And then they bring to it their unique vision of events, their unique prejudices, and of course they write fiction too. I read the original sources, and then I write something which I declare as fiction, which I say, this is not exactly what happened, we don't know exactly what happened, we know what other people said happened, but what I am telling you is how I think it was from the point of view of my prejudices and my viewpoints and my interests.
Thank you. Well, it seems to me that the cooperation and the mutual help that historians have for historical fiction writers is much more important than any differences that may seem to divide us. And the way that comes across most clearly to me is in my teaching. I think we've all had at least 1 or 2 courses with me before. I'm always stressing we have to get inside the heads of medieval people to really understand their motivations, their actions, the way they saw the world. And that's where historical fiction, of course, when it's done well, can go places that I could never go in trying to help us sympathize or understand the world in which they lived and operated.
No, I agree with you completely. And in a sense, I always think getting inside anybody's head is a leap of fiction and is a leap of empathy. So, for instance, if you think about your own best friend, someone that maybe you've known for years and years and with whom you share deep secrets, sometimes they will say or do something that is completely surprising to you because nobody has the ability to entirely get inside someone else's head. It's so much more difficult if there's someone who lived 500 years ago and who experienced a very, very different world that you do. For instance, just in the language, it always strikes me as so funny that there's no point trying to say that someone's touch is electric, that you can't say that their gaze is magnetic. We're writing that in the medieval world about people who don't even understand the circulation of the blood. So you can say that your heart goes faster because we all feel that, but they don't know that means that their blood's going around their body faster. So the whole worldview is intensely different. The whole language is intensely different. To get inside another person's head is a massive challenge. To get inside the head of someone from history is another layer indeed.
Mm-hmm. But you raised the issue of anachronisms, and another way that this course could have been done was to pick really awful examples of historical fiction and tear them apart and look for that sort of thing. And actually, television, I think, even more fun than published printed work. But I think we learn much more about what fiction writers are up to and what historians are up to and how they're mutually reliant in looking at quality work, and both in the nonfiction and fiction materials that we're looking at. But I don't know, maybe next time I do it, we will go the other way, and obviously not interview you for it. It'd be different kind of writers who probably wouldn't want to Skype with us. Does anyone else have a question or a comment along these lines before we talk about the novels?
Yeah, so the question I wanted to ask is how you personally get the head of the characters that you read about. So we read the White Queen and the Red Queen so far. So Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. They're two very different women. So I just wanted to know kind of your process in their headspace.
It's incredibly interesting to me to be at the start of a novel, which is when there's usually about a year before I'm going to start writing the novel, when I'm doing the research. So I make sure that I know all that there is available on these characters. Sometimes there's not very much. In the case of both Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, there was only one worthwhile biography. So in that sense, there isn't much research to do, and there's more space for the fiction. But on the downside, you don't have much to go on. So writing Elizabeth Woodville was really relatively easy because once you understand that her life was completely transformed when she met the young King Edward IV, and you then see what happens to her from then, you see a life which is very, very filled with event, and you see a woman who meets those events with extraordinary courage. So you know from her life history some things about her. Before you even have to invent anything, you know she's really brave, you know she's really persistent, you know that when things go badly for her, she just waits, and she has tremendous courage, waits for better times, and if she can make better things happen, she jolly well does. You know she's physically very strong because she has, I think, 13 babies, in a time when there's no anaesthesia in childbirth. So she's a tough cookie. When I came to someone like Margaret Beaufort, that was much harder because I'd just been in love with Elizabeth Woodville for about 2 years, and now I wanted to write about her enemy. So it was a real question of how was I going to turn my head around to be on the Red side, on the Lancaster side, on Margaret Beaufort's side. And for me, that was, I couldn't get her at all until I started writing. And I wrote very early on that she goes, "God be praised, I have saints' knees," when she makes her knees rough from kneeling in prayer. And it just seemed to me that to an audience and readership who aren't deeply religious, I had to find a way to really express her genuine religious devotion, and at the same time the little thrill of pleasure she got from thinking herself as genuinely and religious and devoted. And that also injecting that bit of humour into my portrait of her just made me feel really comfortable with her, made me enjoy her. So really I've got to think that I know them, and I've got to like them enough to be with them for 2 years. So that's the starting the novel is a long period of research, and only when I really feel that I've grasped the character do I feel I can start speculating about what goes on in their head.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Going along with that, how did you find getting in the head of Jaquetta? Just because if there was not a lot about Elizabeth and Margaret, there's even less about her. So how did you find trying to get into that headspace with almost nothing?
That's when you really fall back on fiction. I mean, what there is about her is there's, in a sense, almost bus stops. You can see points when she's visible in the historical record, and nobody had really researched her at all, except a historian in Luxembourg, because of her relationship to the ducal family of Luxembourg. But so what I had to do with her was track her down, as it were, through the history of her husbands, which had been written, or the history of her queen, Margaret of Anjou, which was obviously written. So every now and then she crops up and she's mentioned, and I know she's there. And one of the most fantastic moments for me was when I discovered that when the City of London came out and begged Margaret of Anjou not to occupy London, because although she was their queen, she was at the head of a very dangerous army, a very uncontrollable army from the north of England. I live in the north of England, and England hates the north of England. It's one of the things. It's one of the things we really love. We're on the edge. Nobody understands us. You will have regions like that in your country, I'm sure. But she's leading this dangerous army, and the citizens of London come out and say, please don't bring them in. And the citizens of London asked 3 ladies to represent them. And one day I found the names of those ladies listed, and one of them was Jaquetta. And my delight at knowing that she was there, seeing that therefore she had the job to go out to say to Margaret of Anjou, I've been your friend for all our lives, and I've been your lady in waiting ever since you came to England as queen, but I have to tell you, your capital city doesn't want you here. An amazing scene. And you know the sort of woman she must be just by knowing that she was picked to say that to the Queen of England. It's not an easy job. So you get ideas of what the character is like from the little glimpses that history gives us of them, and then the rest you have to make up. Also, one of the things that I loved about her is I knew the sort of mother she was, because I'd just been working on her daughter's life. So I knew that she was a woman who could raise a girl really, really well. Raise a girl of courage and imagination and passion and determination. So I know, at any rate, I imagine I know, that she's a fantastic woman. So I like her. She was easy to write.
It's interesting. They've just given me their proposals for the papers. And some of them have the problem of not having many sources for their subjects. And they're taking the same approach. Well, I'll get to know the people around them and their parents, and I'll be able to infer things about from the family dynamic. And so the peripheral figures can tell you about the core person.
Absolutely. And what I find these days, when I started writing, I think the internet was invented. I'm not so old that I think it hadn't been invented. But certainly you didn't use it as a scholar. You just, it wasn't, when I went to do my PhD at Edinburgh University, nobody said, Google it. That wasn't a verb when I was, first studying. But now you can have a little play around. And if you chase the links all over, I'm working at the moment on Margaret Tudor, who was Henry VIII's sister, who goes to be Queen of Scotland. And every single Scottish family has their own website. And if you chase the links on that, you find the character you're looking for turning up constantly in other people's pages, and they maybe only say she came and stayed in our castle one night, and that's not particularly important to them. But it's huge to me because it means I can put her somewhere in time and be sure she was there. And half the time, as a historical novelist, all you're trying to do is know where someone is. That tells you so much about what's going on.
Piecing together the itineraries, right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have any Henrys or Edwards, but we do have a Margaret. And she has the next question.
So it's along the same lines of getting into the headspace. I thought that you were writing from a female perspective more because you're a female author, but then you jump into Jasper's head. And I was just wondering if that was more difficult to write from the male perspective, if you found it easier, or if it was the same, or if it was harder to write from that perspective.
The trouble is that I believe that if you're a woman and you make the imaginative leap and imagine that you're in a woman's head, you can do some reality checking with that. So you can go, for instance, well, I would never do that. I can't imagine even if I was 500 years ago, even if I was in these circumstances, I can't imagine doing that. And in a way, that gives you a sort of a benchmark of female normality. And of course, I don't have a benchmark of male normality because, I'm an old-fashioned feminist. I have to say to you, sometimes I observe male behaviour and it is unbelievable to me. And so I look at how Henry VIII is behaving and I go like, well, that seems pretty crazy, but he's a man, he could be like anything. So it's easier, I think, as a woman writer to write about women, that you have a sense of some ownership of the female experience. However, having said that, I really like writing about men, but I do think that the men I write about are more definitely fictional because they are how I imagine men to be. And when I'm in the real world, I often find that men are not how I imagine them to be, and they don't behave in a way that I would expect them to behave. And to be honest with you, that's rarely a good thing. Often I find men behaving in ways that I find completely incredible, and that would include our political leaders, and men in history with, tyrants in history, and you just go like, I cannot imagine why you would think that was a good idea, but they do. The other thing, I suppose, is that the jump into, I like to go into a female headspace because women's history is still a very, very little regarded area and a very little researched area. So if you're writing about a woman, you are almost always reclaiming her from obscurity. And for me to actually be able to look at some of the women I've written about and know that people, until the vast number of the readers, non-specialist readers, read my books, they had never even heard of them. They had no idea they existed. They kind of knew that Henry VII had a mother because he was clearly, born at some stage. But they had no idea it was Margaret Beaufort and her story and the contribution she made to getting him to the throne. He would never have got on the throne. He would never even have won at the Battle of Bosworth if Margaret Beaufort hadn't prepared the ground for him and married the man who owned the biggest army in England after the king. It's a huge contribution she made and almost entirely unknown until I put her as a heroine in a best-selling novel. And all of a sudden, the story's out for millions of people.
Thank you.
Too much. That's true.
Along those lines, I would like to believe that part of your goal with writing historical fictions is putting or making the history available to the popular audience that nobody would ever have it before. Has that ever backfired on you? Has anyone come back and said, "No, I don't like this. This isn't right"?
Oh, sure. One of the things that you discover really early on about success is that if you're doing something well and you're highly regarded for it, then the people who aren't doing it quite as well yet, or who are climbing that particular slope, are very quick to go like, that was rubbish. And it's very painful actually when people criticise me and I can't see what their problem is, except I have to see that their problem is that I am successful and they are not. That's very nasty. In terms of historians criticising me, it doesn't happen very much because historians understand that nobody is perfect, that I may make mistakes just as they might. And so I can't think, I mean, I think I've had letters now and then from like local historians saying, you say this happens exactly here, but actually we think it happened 10 miles down the road. You know, and I'm grateful for that. And if it comes during the time of the book's publishing cycle, I will change it in the novel to get it right. Something like Richard III being dug up out of a car park has happened this year. You know, 500 years after he was buried, you know, you just go like, I can't put that in any way in the novel, because who knew, who could have imagined it would happen? In a way, the novel itself then becomes part of the history, part of the historiography of the whole thing. So my Richard III does not have scoliosis of the spine because I didn't believe he did. Everything I had read suggested to me that that was like part of the slander against him. And now we've found his body and we see he does have scoliosis of the spine. I wish I had written it differently. But the book's out, it's gone. It's now part of the record. It's part of how books were written before we found the body. It's really, and that's the thing which is really interesting to me, that in a way my work and my life are also part of history. That if you publish for long enough, you become part of the record, which somebody may well come along after me and rewrite better. And that would be brilliant.
But you will have made it possible. Or standing on top of giants.
I am on the train. You know, I'm not the engine. I'm one of the carriages, and there's a long train coming behind. But I think also that you know, if you're working as a historian or you're working as someone writing historical fiction, you are spreading the study of history. And one of the things that's lovely for me is when I go and do reader events, so many people come up and say, I have now started a history degree, or I've gone back to read history, or I'm now writing a PhD even, because I was so taken by your version of this story. And that's wonderful. But at the same time, when yeah, there's all you as well. But you know, when I'm writing a novel, my job is fundamentally to write an entertaining piece of literature. It's not my job to teach history. I do it by accident.
If you encourage people to become history students, all the better.
I think so. And that's because for me, the best thing I ever did in my life was become a history student. I swapped from an English literature course to study history. I fell in love with history, and that was nearly 40 years ago. I mean, I've just loved history ever since. I've not done anything but history ever since.
Any other questions? Yes.
Kind of going off of that, I was wondering if you have ever considered or played with the idea of branching out of the historical fiction genre, maybe like alternative history or historical fantasy or just fantasy. Has that crossed your mind, or are you kind of in love with historical fiction?
I am in love with historical fiction, the form that I've been writing in, which some people call fictional biography. So really focused on one character and fictionalising her story. I've been doing that now actually for a long time. But when I first started, I wrote something which was much more what I would regard as normal, if there's such a thing, historical fiction. So it was a completely fictional family set in fictionalised but recognisably historical past. It was called Wideacre. It was a series I wrote. It was my first book, was Wideacre, and there were 2 other books in the series, and they were set in the 18th century Sussex county in England. Right now, I'm working on a series which is called The Order of Darkness, and that's set in the medieval period. So in this period that I've been working in for so long now, but is for completely fictional people experiencing fictional adventures, but in what I hope is a realistic, historically accurate Europe. So I play around on the borders, but and I've written contemporary novels as well, and I've written children's fiction as well. So I'm not absolutely wedded to this form, but it's so satisfying to research, and it's so enjoyable to write that I haven't finished with it yet. I think I'll be doing a few more. Yeah.
Sorry, can I tell you that I read White Acre and I did love it? I read the entire series and it actually helped me get to where I am. Actually, yeah.
I'm very pleased. It's people often confess to reading White Acre because I have to tell the rest of you, it's really sexy. It really is, especially the first book. It kind of was a little shocking, but I really like the first and the last book, but Meridian in the Center wasn't as influential to me, but the first and the last. Definitely say stuff. It's quite interesting that it was. I wrote it in the mid-80s, and at the time, people had all the historical fiction you could read was, in a sense, quite respectable. It was quite bourgeois. It was very class orientated. So it was about lords and ladies, and the ladies were always chaste, and the lords always loved them really honourably. And they melted into each other's arms as the happy ending, and the door closed on them. They always got married, and the door closed respectfully on them. And I wrote a novel about, I think there's no reason not to think it's historically accurate, about a sort of an earlier 18th century character. And we know, Maud Flanders, people that Richardson doesn't write about, but that we know were there. Women who were sexually active and who were very conscious of their bodies as currency in the 18th century marriage market. And these are really before Jane Austen's time, so they are sexually much more liberated than the 18th century, the traditional 18th century Victorian heroine. There's a period of female bawdiness because, as you know, there isn't one long line from, repressed historical past to the incredibly liberated now. This comes and goes, and it comes and goes with how women are being used as commodities. So the period when women are absolutely bought and sold and traded is the period where female celibacy and virginity is very, very prized. Because if you're going to sell your daughter, you want to sell your virginal daughter. You don't want a girl who's been around the block a bit.
I find that interesting. When I was reading it, I definitely focused more on the political aspect, whereas the family were trying to go through the male line, whereas the women were the ones that seemed more, apt to running the land. I find that interesting that you focus on the sexual aspect, because I did have to hide that first book from my family, but yeah, and then it continues through that whole mythical idea of like the woman and the land. So it's kind of interesting to actually hear your perspective.
I am amused that you hid it. I actually thought about hiding my authorship, that I was going to publish it under another name, because at the time that I was writing it, I had just finished my PhD, which said Philippa Gregory on the spine, and there's a very serious PhD about the 18th century novel and the 18th century society, and I wasn't sure that I wanted a sexy historical fiction with my name on it at the same time, and I took the decision that I was proud of everything I write, and if I'm not proud of it, I won't publish it. So I put it out under my name, and I'm glad that you can now acknowledge in front of your peers that you read it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I just have a question when we're talking about historical fiction, that with this series you choose to focus on 3 women of the Cousins' War who are important figures, but when you come to talk about other figures like, for example, Richard, Duke of York, or Edward IV, when you're writing a historical fiction from that point, how hard do you find it to not let these other important figures take over your narrative of these women?
It's always really hard to tell the story of the people who aren't very well known, because the research is harder, but also because you, in your mind, you have such a powerful image and such a powerful narrative that you already know. So in a sense, the stuff you've known for a long time always tends to dominate. One of the big examples of that I found was when I was writing The Other Boleyn Girl, about Mary Boleyn, that it was almost impossible not to find oneself constantly writing about Anne, because you know that Anne's story is so massive. Anne's story is in the spotlight for almost all the time, whereas Mary's story is very often completely off the page. She goes away, we don't know what she's doing. So I had to make myself follow her and go away from the court, where we know what's going on. What's going on is fabulously interesting. And when they came to write, the scriptwriter Peter Morgan, who wrote the film The Other Boleyn Girl, told me that he had exactly the same process when he was writing the film. And I said to him, no, the story is not Anne Boleyn's story. We are not doing the Tudors with all the obvious story points ticked off as we go along. It's not the Tudor itinerary. It's not Anne of 1,000 Days itinerary. It's The Other Boleyn Girl. We're telling the other story. And that's a real struggle. In some novels, a powerful struggle to not go to the better known story.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions, things that we have discussed already as a class, and would like to get to your thoughts. There are points in the first two novels, and I can't remember the rivers. I've read it before. I haven't reread it yet, where you move away from the first-person narrative to the omniscient viewer in terms of recounting battles. And I was just wondering, we were wondering about that choice and why you made it.
Mm-hmm. You're well spotted. I mean, I did it, and I really hope nobody would ever notice. I did it because I love the first-person narrative. Let me tell you about the first-person narrative, first of all. It's brilliant for the non-historian reader because it skips you through the bits that everybody hates about history. So if you put a prologue in front of a history novel written in the third person, you might as well say, this happened a long, long time ago and everybody's dead. So it's boring. It's just, there's no point you really reading about it, because even if I tell you there's a happy ending, there isn't really, because they're dead. So really what I want to do is I want to get the reader in the first page and say, you are here. This is happening now. This is an incredible danger to you personally right this minute. What's going to happen next? And that's what makes especially the non-historian reader turn the page, because they, in a sense, you've managed this leap, and they don't know they're reading a historical novel. They think they're reading a story about them in the here and now. It happens that the here and now they're in is 500 years old, but they never get a feeling of that. And one of the ways that I introduce research is to make sure that you never get a bit where you go, hang on a minute, you look that up. Oh God, I don't want to read stuff in the library now. I want to read a novel. So it's a trick, and it's a trick that I discovered. I'm sure other people discovered it before me, but I discovered it in the course of my writing and loved it. And that's why it's present tense as well, so that you, the reader, I, the reader, I'm in the story here and now. How am I going to survive? That's the opening page of practically everything I've written since I started writing in this way. The real disadvantage to first-person narrative is the one that you spotted, which is that I cannot forever be as it happens in these amazing historical events. Especially if you're writing about someone who isn't a key player, there are times when they're going to be off in the country or out of the room or asleep, or, it would be implausible that they are forever riding past the field where the battle's happening. So you get trapped, in a sense, by this one person's life. You have to be inside it. So sometimes I have somebody come in and say something terrible's happened, and they say, oh, what? And then the person tells them. But, readers don't like that very much, and I don't like it very much. And it does mean that you have tons of reported action, which really requires an incredibly creative messenger who describes it to you really vividly in order to make it worth reading. So what I decided to do recently was just to go, okay, the rule is that we're in first-person narrative, and since it's my novel, I'm just going to break the rule, and I'm going to describe the battle as if I, my first-person narrator, somehow knew all about it. As you say, I go into omniscient narration for the period of that thing which she wasn't there to see, but that I want the reader to see. Desperately, I want the reader to realise the terror and the glory and the horror of this event. And then I come back to first person again. And truly, I honestly hope nobody would notice. And you have noticed. Pity.
Well, it certainly, I mean, it is about conflict. It's about a time of terrible bloodshed and great losses. And that just simply can't be communicated by your chief character receiving reports from people who are there. No matter how bloody they come dragging into the stable yard and recount their horrible experiences, it's not the same as being there. And you did choose particularly important battles, of course, to actually make that departure. So we have lots to talk about around that, and thank you for discussing it. Any other questions?
Well, I just wanted to say that one thing I noticed when you're switching from the first person to the omniscient narration is that when I read it, I almost read it as a transition to like a dream of the character. Was that did you think that was a way to bring it in, or is that just sort of unintentional and I just picked it up in my reading?
I think you're really right. That's very perceptive. That's interesting. Sometimes I think I do. I couldn't put my finger on where, but I think there are novels when the character seems to be imagining or seems to be dreaming the scene that I want to tell. Certainly, I've just got it in my mind. I can't think why, but I think I've got somebody drowning at sea or being in a terrible storm at sea, and the character is sort of imagining it. And so it does have that sort of dreamy state. But when you're absolutely right that when it's a case of having to know about the battle, it is as if it would be like a dream picture, because the omniscient narrator is in a sense above it or beyond it or over it. So you do get that sort of dream perspective on it. It's a very, I mean, I do think when I first did it, when I first moved from first person narrator, I did go, this feels like a really risky thing to do. And certainly I've got round the problem by doing it in dreams, or I think Elizabeth Woodville dreams the battle at Towton, I think. Does she? I think she does. I think she might. You can look it up and tell me. But I think she might.
They all three have different ways of knowing than the normal five senses, right? They have the sight, or they have visions, or hallucinations, or feelings and senses that are other ways of knowing.
Yes. And I think one of the interesting things about doing first-person narrative is that you can go into the first-person narrator's dream world very comfortably, because we know that we dream things and that we sometimes wake and we are disturbed by what we've imagined, or we have a daydream, and that's working on the unconscious material. And I think when you're in first-person narration, it's very easy to step inside that. If you're in third-person narration, it's another step away from the reader in a way. So Fred Bloggs, thinks this, and then he fell asleep, and now he dreams this. We're somewhere else again. We're another step away from the immediacy of the happening.
And that's just another way of getting inside the 15th century worldview, because they had a bigger imaginative life, I suppose, in terms of the ways that they could know things, or get a sense of things. They believed dreams and acted on them in ways that we don't.
Absolutely, and they had a very, very powerful spiritual life as well, which really, really matters. So in the case of Margaret Beaufort, I do believe that she believed that she had been guided by God from the very beginning. And so actually being able to incorporate that without trying to convince the reader that they believe in God. It's really useful to be in first person by that. So you can read it and you can go, this is a completely deluded fundamentalist Christian with no opportunity to read anything scientific, anything non-religious, anything. A lot of the stuff you'll be reading will be actually irrational. So in a way, to put the reader into that head is quite difficult to do, but I think much more interesting than trying to say to the reader, this is what a highly religious woman in the 14th century would think. You know, it's much more interesting for the reader, I think, to try and put them into that foreign mindset.
Right, that's one of the things we were just discussing before the interview was the different intellectual worlds that the Woodvilles and Margaret occupied in terms of books that they would read and types of learning that they thought were valid and important. So another point of contrast, not just political, but intellectual contrast, religious paganism versus super devout Christianity and so on. The contrasts are really instructive.
Yes, absolutely. And particularly, I think the magic in Lady of the Rivers, and she's, of course, Elizabeth Woodville's mother, that comes through into White Queen, is is, as far as I know, absolutely congruent with what people thought of at the time. So Elizabeth Woodville's mother, Chiquetta, is genuinely put on trial for witchcraft. They have a trial. They have witnesses who say they saw her charming, and the verdict goes against her. Now, in many ways, it's a show trial, and when Edward comes back to the throne, she's never punished. But they did, there was enough belief in it for them to find witnesses who declared that they had seen her charming, and for them to produce these little charms that they say she made of her son-in-law and her daughter. And I think the reason a lot of this history, particularly history of witchcraft, gets lost is partly because historians have only relatively recently, in the past 50 years, been interested in the history of women, and it is women who are responsible for a lot of the alleged witchcraft. And the other reason is that historians in the modern world, ever since the Victorians, tend to be rationalists, and they don't want to study something that simply isn't the case. They have no interest in studying witchcraft because they have already decided before they even study it that it can't be true. So why would you waste your time studying something that is a fantasy, a ridiculous medieval fantasy of people who can't understand what is the truth, which is the scientific cause of the phenomena that they think are caused by witchcraft, which really means that you end up dismissing a whole gender of people and a whole and a whole set of beliefs. So you go like witchcraft. I know witchcraft isn't effective. Therefore, I know it cannot be true. Therefore, everybody who is engaging in it is either a liar or completely deluded. So all of these women who I have rich records of are either liars or delusionists. So I'm not going to bother researching them.
We discussed how both the witchcraft and the hyper-piety of Margaret Beaufort represent women trying to gain greater agency over events and trying to make a difference where the normal legitimate authority don't. But you didn't have to create that for these people. This really is part of their historical reputation. You want to comment on that?
Oh, absolutely, it's part of their reputation. And also, I kind of smiled when you said hyper-piety, because of course it is to us, but to them she was just a particularly good woman, and she was beatified. She's the Blessed Margaret, as indeed are several of my heroines, because they did live a life of learning and devotion, as part of, exactly as you say, as part of trying to become, I think, trying to get legitimate power. I think it really is about how does a woman make a difference in the world that she lives in, when the world that she lives in is so terribly, nightmarishly oppressive. So women in the Tudor period, not only do they not have the rights of their own bodies. They marry where they are ordered, and their husbands have legal right to rape them, and it's not even called rape, it's marital rights. But the husband also has a legal right to beat them, provided he doesn't use a stick thicker than his little finger. So you're literally enslaved. You have no rights over property. If you have children, they do not belong to you, they belong to your husband, and he has a right to beat you if he wants to. In that world, you can readily see why women would seek greater power to bring to this situation. What are they going to do? And I think what they do is they really deploy their sexuality, which is they use their bodies as best they can to get themselves out of trouble, or they use their imaginative power in witchcraft or in spirituality to try and gain more power than the society grants them.
Any further questions or comments?
I have a PS to that, if I just may, which is why, speaking to young women today, you have more power in your society now than you ever had, and the power you want, you can generally get by legal and intellectual means. You do not need to use witchcraft, God, or pimp yourself out.
Wonderful. And one more question, please.
It's to do with history, but I have to ask because I don't have an author in front of me today. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
I have tons of advice for aspiring writers. And I mean, the first thing is doing exactly what you're doing, which is read a lot of stuff. And my advice would be also read the old-fashioned canon. Read stuff that is literature. Please do not waste your time reading rubbish, because although you may say to yourself, I could do better than this, that's almost certain to be true. What you want to do is you want to look at someone like Jane Austen or George Eliot or E.M. Forster and say, could I do better than that? And every time I sit down to write, I have a sort of ideal novel in my mind. And I can't tell you how great it is. It's fantastic. It really is. It's the sort of thing that Jane Austen would go, damn, if I could write like that. And I set about this idealised novel every single time I start. And every time I finish, I go, well, it wasn't as good as I imagined it would be, but it's the best Philippa Gregory novel I can do this year. I'm pleased with it, but I thought I was going to be ecstatic. So, aim very high and read a lot. And it's only through reading that you will see how authors solve the problems that you're going to encounter. And may I ask, do you want to write historical fiction?
I write... fantasy.
Historical fantasy?
No, just straight up fantasy.
Well, in a way, we all do. How very, very interesting. I mean, absolutely good luck with it. And so who would be the best writer, the best author of fantasy that you would use, not to copy, but as inspiration?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, there's the classic Tolkien. Today, Patrick Rothfuss, I think he's amazing. George R.R. Martin. There's so many that I can think of.
And other fantasy novels written in like the 19th century, or is it mostly a modern thing?
I think for the most part, modern. After Tolkien stuff.
Yes. It's very, very interesting. There are a few. I had to read the popular fiction of the 18th century because that was my PhD, and there were a few 18th century fantasy novels, of which you would know Robinson Crusoe, which is obviously a sort of fantasy biography, but there's a whole set of books called The New Crusoe and The Flying Crusoe, when people like fly away to desert islands and marry sort of fairies. There's a very, very funny erotic scene in one of the novels where this man makes love to a fairy, and he tries to describe it in a novel which is going to be published by an 18th century publisher, and she wraps him in her gauzy wings. And I remember going like, that's a nice image. Yeah. Interesting.
The sexy Tinkerbell.
Well, thank you.
I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much for that question. It's nice that at the end of the interview, it's advice that's coming forth, and for young people, that's of course an value from an experienced and accomplished person like yourself. And so, one more question. Okay.
Just
ask for
related.
advice.
Yeah, kind of. I'd like to write historical fantasy. So my question is, how, when you're writing a historical novel, not get so enveloped in trying to create the most accurate world as possible? How do you let yourself be like, well, this might not have been exactly how this world was, or exactly what had happened at this moment?
When I'm writing, so I'm writing historical fiction, which I am trying to write exactly what happened, and probably the fiction is the why it happened, or usually history is mostly about events. So I generally know what happened. The fiction is probably why somebody let it happen, or how somebody responded to the event. So I'm pretty well on the record there. Every now and then there's something which is a genuine mystery to historians. For instance, the really famous one is what happened to the princes in the tower, Elizabeth Woodville's boys. And, there are a number of very good fictions written about that, and some of those fictions pass themselves off as history. We don't know. We still don't know. I don't know we're ever going to know. I hope one day we will. And, I too have added my opinion of what happened to the princes in the tower. And when you're writing a novel, you don't have the luxury that the historian has of being able to say, it might be this, it might be this, it might be this, but I think that. When you're a novel, especially if you're a first-person present tense novel, if you're the boy's mother, you know what you think happened, and you'd never say to somebody, my boy's disappeared from the tower, and it might be this, it might be this, it might be this, or I think that. You would make it your business to get to a conclusion on that. And I cannot subscribe to a view which goes, Elizabeth Woodville sort of lost them and never looked. And that's when we were talking earlier about the mindset of a woman. I sometimes, very rarely, fall back on I am a woman and therefore I know, but I do fall back on I am a mother and therefore I know that my children's uncle would not take him into the Tower of London and them disappear, and me never make a point of meeting him and saying, you remember those little boys that you took? And like historians write it as if she just simply forgot about them. Because from the historian's point of view, the event is him taking them, then there isn't a concluding event. So the historians sort of forget about them. So heaven knows where we got there. So yes, so when I'm writing about Elizabeth Woodville, I have to write a scene. I have to write a scene where she says to Richard III, where are my children that you took? Of course I have to write that scene. I couldn't not write it. I don't know that it ever happened. There's no record of it ever happening, but I would put a lot of money on that conversation took place. What I don't know, what drives me mad, is what he answered. And in terms of historical fantasy, how much you are on the record and how much you are away from it is, I suppose, the luxury of your genre. You can choose. And then also, it's not just a luxury of your genre, it's a luxury of how you write your genre. Yours could be unlike anyone else's. So I think that's really rather good fun for you. I think you can do what you like.
It's ironic that you have more choice than historians, but you also can't explain and qualify the choices like we can. I've never thought of that before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why my author's note almost always is an explanation of why I took the decision I took in the novel, especially if it's something controversial.
Right. But it has to be separate. It can't be integral. Yeah. Interesting. Well, we've gone over the time that we've been promised with you. I hope that means that you enjoyed yourself. We certainly have.
I really have. It's been a pleasure to meet you, actually. I've really enjoyed it. It's very funny for me because I live in a cottage in Yorkshire and it's pouring with rain outside, so I wasn't going to go outside and be doing anything. So it's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Terrific. Well, we'll join me in thanking Philippa Gregory for joining us. And thank you to Zora for facilitating this too.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.